people of the United States. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Hello and welcome to George Washington Slept Here, the civic education podcast from Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, where we explore American history, civics, and the idea of liberty through conversations with some of our favorite thinkers, writers, and leaders. I'm Jason Raia, Chief Operating Officer at Freedom's Foundation and host of George Washington Slept Here. The format is simple, a long-form conversation with a friend of Freedom's Foundation where everyone can learn something new. Before we go any further, a little self-promotion. This podcast is how we reach a larger audience beyond our Valley Forge campus. So if you enjoy the show, please help us spread the word by telling your friends. And if you want to support the show, you can donate by going to our website, www.freedomsfoundation.org/podcast. We love hearing from listeners, so feel free to email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or suggestions. Today's interview is with civil rights leader Robert Woodson. Hello, Mr. Woodson.
Hello, how are you?
I'm great. So happy to be here with you. Our conversation today is going to be structured in a way to keep us on track. We want to explore your origin story. How did you become the person sitting here before us, which is here at the Woodson Center in Washington, D.C., and your current work, what you are doing, the great groups that you're working with. And then I want to talk with you about the state of America today. And this is a place where for our listeners to know that we are going to get into a little bit of the 1619 Project and 1776 Unites and talk about that controversy. And then we will finally end with a quiz for which you do not need to prepare. It's just for fun. So tell us, where were you born and raised?
Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, during the Depression, 1937, in South Philadelphia. It's a low-income, blue-collar neighborhood.
And if I remember correctly from your book, you talked about there were still horse carts that were coming through the city and delivering to families.
Oh, yes. It was quite a festive time on Saturday morning. Hucksters would come through with horse-drawn wagons selling peaches, watermelon, fish, and women would gather around these wagons and gossip. And it was a very festive time. Your small street, it was Garrett Street, was almost like a family. So it was a very intact neighborhood.
Right, a real community.
A real community.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
It was during the time of segregation, so we, at third grade plays at the Smith School were held at night so that parents could attend. And as you came into the auditorium, the table in the back was filled with lunch pails.
Mm.
There were so many parents attending a third grade play.
Right, coming straight from work.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because you grew up in the era of Jim Crow, when segregation was part of the law, not just an unfortunate happenstance between individuals, but enshrined in law. And then how did that affect your life, and how did it not affect your life?
Well, it did not affect my life because, as far as we were concerned, we were defined by the people we saw every day. The shopkeepers, the store owners, they were all black. Mm-hmm. The churches, the barbershops. The only white person we saw come in was an old Italian man selling what they called Javella water, which was bleach and sharpening knives and whatnot. But that was pretty much our life. Also, there was no association between poverty and pathology.
Tell me more about that.
Everybody was poor. Remember, I'm coming out of the Depression into the war. The Depression, we didn't have money, and during the war, things were rationed.
Right.
So it was not uncommon for me to have holes in my shoes. And instead of telling my mother that, I would just find some cardboard and cut around and put them in, because everybody had the face.
Everybody had holes in their shoes.
Everyone had holes in their shoes.
Yep.
And you made do with what you had.
Right.
So there was no stigma attached to it, and also there was no expectation that because you're poor that you would be violent or somehow unruly.
Right, right. So you are growing up in South Philly, and you decide to you lost your father
My
fairly early.
Dad moved us. He moved us out of South Philly into West Philly, which is just opening up for blacks. And it
Okay.
was a cultural shock because there's trees in front of it. There are no trees in South Philadelphia. It was built on a dump. It was a landfill,
Yeah,
literally.
yeah.
So there are no trees. And so suddenly we're in West Philadelphia. There are large streets with trees and porches. And it was an amazing cultural shock
Right.
to see that. But my dad moved us out. And within a month or two, he became ill. And then 2 years later, he died, leaving my mother with a fifth grade education and 5 children to raise by herself.
Wow.
She was a domestic, so she didn't have much time to read to us after school.
Right, right.
So it meant that I had to rely a lot on my peers, and I was blessed to have the kind of values I selected good friends. Some of your listeners who are older will know one of them was Gordon on Sesame Street, Matt Robinson. He was the black guy with the afro.
Yeah.
He was the first one on Sesame Street. He was the only one that made it big.
I love it. So, but eventually you make the decision to drop out of school and go into the Air Force.
Yeah, my friends we call ourselves the fellas. There were about 6 of us. And I didn't realize at the time that they were a year older than me.
Okay.
And so when they left school, graduated, and went on to college, I was unaffiliated. Suddenly, I was by myself.
Right.
And so I wasn't really participating that actively in school anyway. I was there because they were there.
Right. Right.
So I dropped out and went into the Air Force at 3 months into my 17th birthday. And that was quite a cultural shock, too. It was amazing, though, and a great experience.
Right.
Because the military made you responsible. I got on a plane for the first time, and suddenly I went into the military believing that black people were a majority in America.
And
You can read all the books you want on
Right.
demographics, but it's more informed by what your actual experience is. And so suddenly I'm looking at 400 people coming in a weekend, and only 8% were black.
right.
In
Right.
my squadron. So.
And you write about in one of your books this dual experience of that it was in the military, in the Air Force, that you came to realize that you could learn because they entrusted you. You tested. You were doing this stuff on top secret missile guidance programs that you would never have thought you could do.
I had no confidence in my ability to learn, even though I was smart in school. I used to get A's as a kid, but I didn't think very much of it. But the Air Force did, after about 30 days of being in training, they give you a day of diagnostic training, testing. And so then you get a counselor assigned to you. And he says, according to your test scores, you could be an engineer or anything else you wanted to, and we're going to send you to a specialty school, only 8 people going from the class. You're going to go to Keesler Field in Mississippi to be trained in airborne electronics.
Which I am imagining is a fairly new field.
Yes, and so I was trained there. It was a top secret building, which meant that you couldn't take any books home, and no windows in the buildings. And you studied 3 hours of theory, 3 hours of practice, and you were tested every Friday. If you washed back twice, you were washed out.
Right, right.
It's very competitive.
So here the military has said, regardless of your skin color, you tested well, we're going to give you this opportunity, but you're going to have to work hard for it. And then you said you had a sergeant who tried to be an obstacle to that.
Oh, yeah. I had some people who were working who did everything possible to thwart my chance. Because remember, I got my GED once I decided that the Air Force, and then I went to some college courses in math at the University of Miami, but it was segregated, so I couldn't go on campus. So the Air Force arranged to have classes, certified classes, on the base.
So you could attend.
So, but my sergeant flew me on nights that I had classes. And so I was an athlete, so I went to base command, my squadron commander, who was an athlete, I told him they would give me a hard time, so he demanded that they ground me on nights that I had classes. So there were always whites on the other side of the problem curve who countered the evil things done by some whites who are racist.
Right. So the lesson there was there are good people and there are bad people, regardless of their color, regardless of where they came from.
Absolutely. That was constantly an experience, that you had some people who, and they did some terrible, whenever you are flying at night, just a pilot and yourself, and you're supposed to physically check under the floorboards to see if the transmitter is there. But it's a court-martial offense if you don't log it out. So most people just come and look at the log. If it's not logged out, you assume it's there.
Right.
And they knew that.
Yeah.
So the same man set me up, flew me on that night, took the equipment out. So I'm up here flying with the pilot, co-pilot, and all of the stations downrange are open to receive my signal. And I said, my operation equipment looks fine. They said, check the floorboard. It was empty. And I said, I laughed, actually. I said, they got me this time.
Yeah. But you took it as a lesson.
I did.
Yeah.
I just said, I knew what happened. There's nothing I could do to complain. I had to take. So the pilot asked, is there anybody we can blame for this? I said, nope, it's my responsibility.
Right.
So.
Right. But there's that lesson, that early lesson, and we're going to get to it, of personal responsibility, how important
also,
that is for you.
And not despair because somebody has done things to you that is harmful.
Right.
See, I never gave into despair, nor did I say, did I give into bitterness.
Right. You chose how to react to what had happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I knew that it was clear. I said, they're not going to make me like them.
Right. So how long were you in the Air Force?
4 years.
4 years. And then eventually you go on to Cheney University and then the University of Pennsylvania, where you did a master's in social work and went into social work for a while, but were pretty unsatisfied by that path. What happened there?
Because I really saw how the child welfare system was really injuring families. That I was in foster care. So only 3% of children who are abandoned or neglected by their parents have any psychological dysfunction when they come into foster care.
Right.
But the more they move these children, the more the child declines, the more the child acts out, the more subsidy comes from the federal government into the state system.
Right.
So I said there, so that it's, let's say, $10,000 in foster care. If the child acts out, they go into a therapeutic home where the reimbursement rate is twice that. And if they continue to act out, they go into a group therapeutic home so you really are incentivizing the destruction. So the more a child moves and is disrupted, the higher value they are to the system. So I pushed back against that. And I said, we are injuring children with the helping hand.
Right. The intention might have been good to help, but the consequences of the system that was established or is established, because we know it still exists.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his letter from prison, made this point, that the most difficult human phenomena to confront isn't malice, because malice you can confront with violence. It's folly.
Yeah.
It's when someone is doing something that they believe is in your interest that is injuring you with the helping hand.
Right.
Oh, why are you upset? My intentions are noble. Yeah, but the consequence of this noble intention is the destruction of people. And so that's why folly is more difficult to challenge.
Right. So how did you become involved in the civil rights movement? I know you met Dr. King a couple of times. Tell us about your work, how you became involved, and then I would maybe this is my word and it's too strong, but disillusioned with the movement.
Yeah, well, I saw that a lot of these kids in the system were black, and so I began to, and also I noticed that with the school systems, that a lot of the kids were in failing schools, and it was segregated, and housing was segregated. I couldn't in Westchester rent any place I wanted to, so I got involved as a young civil rights activist, and unseated an older leader at the time. And so I got involved, but I became very disenchanted over the issue of forced busing for integration. I believe that the opposite of segregation is desegregation, not integration.
Okay.
Because I was debating this with Julius Chambers, the head of the black lawyer from Harvard, who had the NAACP Legal Defense Fund before the New York Bar Association. And I said, Julius, if you have two schools, one is all black where there's a presence of excellence, and school B is integrated where there's diminished excellence, where should we send our children? He said to school B.
Wow.
I said then
because the goal there was integration, not the excellence of the education.
Right, and I said that a goal should be excellence.
Right.
And then if you pursue excellence, then integration should be a byproduct of excellence.
So you really are a believer in the sort of market economy, even within education, that if you create something that is excellent, if you create something, people will want to be there, and that will sort out some of these other really important issues, but they will get sorted out by the fact that you're striving for excellence.
For more than 2.5 decades, the word enterprise was in my organization's name. National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, right. Center for Neighborhood, because I still do believe that the principles of the market economy should apply to the social economy. Only 3% of the people in the market economy are entrepreneurs, but they generate 70% of the jobs.
That I read that statistic, and it doesn't surprise me, and yet it shocks me that to think that 3% of entrepreneurs are creating 70% of jobs, and how important that is. So let's.
But also, they're C students too.
Yes, and you talk about that right. They're they're
not A students.
Right. These are the ones who often drop out of school, who do not do particularly well in a setting that requires testing and sitting still in your seat. I've met those when I was teaching, those kids who are frenetic and can't sit still, and yet that there are the gears are turning all the time, but you before you came to found the Woodson Center here, you worked at the NAACP, the National Urban League. You were a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You moved into policy. What lessons did you take from that experience?
Well, first of all, I used to despise policymakers. Because they were just wasting their time. Then I realized that they were setting the rules of the game.
Okay.
So winners or losers are not necessarily determined by the skill of the participant. It's the rules of the game.
Right. Right.
And so then I met Dr. Peter Berger, the first conservative that I ever met in my life. And what I found refreshing about him is he argued with me.
Okay.
Usually white liberals do not argue with black people. They just smile, and no matter how stupid things you say, they'll say, "Oh, that's great. It sounds good." But Peter Berger literally challenged me, and I really found it refreshing to have an argument with the person on issues. And so Peter Berger invited me when I was with the Urban League to meet with James Q. Wilson and some of the notables in conservatism. And I challenged the notion that if you increase the cost of crime will go down.
Oh, interesting.
And so I said to him that this didn't work in areas because the young people that I deal with on the streets don't make that calculus.
Right.
That they have to first invest in them before you can withdraw anything. Mm-hmm. So there has to be moral and spiritual investments into that account before you can withdraw from that account.
Right.
And so that put me at odds with them. And then Peter invited me to come to the American Enterprise Institute to further my discussion and work.
So tell me, when did you found what originally was the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, what is now the Woodson Center? When did that happen, and what made you feel like you needed to do this?
Well, for 5 years, I was at the American Enterprise Institute. They did a good job. I was able to bring in practitioners, and the books that I wrote about A Summons to Life, I was able to go back to gang members and sit for a year and follow them around to find out what transformed and redeemed them. And I wrote a book, A Summons to Life. And then once I knew what to look for, I went around the country and identified 7 of these Josephs, as I call them.
Right.
And I brought them to the American Enterprise Institute and had scholars, actually Peter Berger and his wife Brigitte and Dr. Robert B. Hill, sit in a room for 3 days, scholars that were secure enough to be able to sit and listen to untutored people.
Right.
And so my second book out there was Youth Crime and Urban Policy, A View from the Inner City, where I just stayed out of it by recording so the scholars are able to ask probing questions that probe the depth of the process of redeeming people. So that book was reviewed by the Vanderbilt Law Review, primarily because Bob Woodson stayed out of it.
Right.
And let the young people tell their story.
Right.
And so that's what, but that was a think tank. They say, we don't do anything here. We just think about it. So I hit my glass ceiling.
Right.
And I said, I've got to find a way of going in and actually with an appreciation of policy, but I still need to support and promote actions that are taken to generate change and redemption and transformation in these communities.
So there's a couple. There were 3 things that I noticed in reading, particularly from Lessons from the Least of These. You talk about personal responsibility. You talk about agency. And you talk about these grassroots leaders. And this is the quote that I loved. You said they are antibodies to the societal ills that are decimating lives. Tell us about these grassroots leaders that you discovered once you started interacting in these communities.
Well, and it affected my faith. I started the center for 10 years to pursue social justice for poor people. But then I found out through my friend Leon Watkin, a young man who was living in South Central Los Angeles, 62nd and Pico, and his neighborhood was terrorized by 26 members of the East Side Crips gang. Mm-hmm. So Leon became tired of it, and he put up these wanted poster signs saying he wants to meet with the leaders. And he gave a phone number for a phone booth. So they kept playing games. So finally, one day, Leon met with them on a Friday night and in the back alley where they're big enough for dump trucks to come through. And they came up with 2 carloads of them, as we say, strapped down with guns and colors flying. And Leon is walking towards him by himself with jeans on and a T-shirt with his hands out to his side. And so they said, I heard you looking for me. And he said, yeah, I want to talk to you about your life. Leon sat on a trash can for 3 hours and had this young man in Bible study the next day. And then a week later, he had the whole 26-member gang in Bible study. Well, I'm watching this, absolutely flabbergasted by what I'm witnessing. And so I asked Leon, and then I ended up helping Leon establish a not-for-profit, and these young men set up a business where they were cutting lawns, cutting grass. Small business owners who they used to terrorize, they ended up working for them, painting their businesses, and they became ambassadors of peace. And so it changed my whole understanding of how transformation works. And so from the experience I had with Leon, again, I knew what to look for. And together what I learned with before, I knew that the Woodson Center from that day forward would have to learn. So I had for 2 years town meetings all over the country where I called grassroots leaders together to ask them what works and why does it work. And so I had now 2 years, 200 case studies of how communities became transformed as a consequence of having the Leon Watkins as, and so it deepened my understanding of what a Joseph is. I learned about transparency. I learned, and all of the 10 principles, Woodson principles, were gleaned from these interactions with these healing agents,
Right.
these community antibodies, and collectively they represent an immune system.
Right. Right. And two of the main principles that when they are working with, whether it is someone who is addicted to drugs or someone who has been involved with other crime, violence, that the call to personal responsibility, that you take responsibility for your actions. You don't blame others. You don't look for an excuse. And that in their changing their lives, that they have to have their agency. They have to be they have to be the one making the decision.
But the person who engages in such an approach to a person has social trust and moral authority.
Right.
Some of the young people said, I knew Leon when he used to be a drug dealer. And if he can become redeemed and transformed, he then becomes a powerful witness to these young people.
Right.
See, a witness is more powerful than an advocate.
Right. Right. Because they've been part of it. They've experienced the awfulness of it and have turned their own lives around.
And experience will always triumph an argument.
So two quotes that I pulled that I feel like really encapsulate who you are and the work that you're doing. You said every life and every community has within it the capacity to improve itself. And then you said, help them strive to succeed above all reasonable expectations. That was a lesson I learned when I was teaching, that students would meet your expectations, whatever they were. If you set low expectations for them, if you complained about how this kid just was never going to accomplish anything, they met that expectation and they did exactly what you said they were going to do. If you set high expectations that they could achieve beyond what they had achieved so far, they often would meet those expectations too.
They really do, but it's also another dimension to that. It is reciprocity. And that is, you get something from those kids too. It isn't just one way.
Absolutely.
You know, in my book, I asked one of my closest colleagues who helped me start the center, Carl Hardrick, Carl, I hear a lot of what you're talking about, what you've done for the kids, but what do they do for you?
Right.
And Carl told me this incredible story that in Hartford, his brother was beaten by these two guys in the hospital, paralyzed from the neck down, and Carl went with him. He has Steve Holton with him, a little 16-year-old ex-gang member, the leader who he had turned out. And his brother said, Carl, this is who hit me and beat me. I know you'll get him. And Carl was enraged, so he stormed out of the hospital. And young Steve Holton said to him, Brother Carl, if what you told me don't mean anything, I'll get my gun and go with you. But if what you said to me means anything, you'd call the police. Tell me which way you want to roll. Carl said it just stopped him in his tracks and saved his life.
Yeah.
So we have got to give these young people an opportunity to know that they have value that can have the consequence of rescuing someone else.
Right. Welfare reform. We talked a little bit about policy. There was a statistics you put in your book, in a couple of your books. $22 trillion spent in poverty programs since Johnson and the Great Society. And what's been the result?
That we've got more poverty than we did before. Thomas Sowell in his books talk about In the black community, poverty dramatically reduced from 1940 from I think 82% down to 46%. And over the next decade, it dropped down even further, almost 20 points. But it has leveled off since we had the war on poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Because 70 cents of every dollar went not to the poor, but professionals who serve the poor. They ask not which problems are solvable, but which ones are fundable this year.
So if there was one thing you would do different, if there was one suggestion that you could make to Congress on what to fund or how to best help with welfare reform and fighting against poverty, what would you recommend?
Voucherize almost everything. Provide resources to people to make their own judgments as to where their children should go to school, who their lawyers ought to be, instead of having some professionals make those decisions for you.
Mm-hmm. So as much as possible, put choice back in the hands.
To the hands of the individual or the institutions. In our books, we talk about how all of these institutions of families and fraternal organizations in the black community, when the government was hostile to the black community, we relied upon all of these self-help organizations, fraternities, elderly care homes, that the church ran our elderly facilities.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those were decimated during the 60s when government came in with their $22 trillion and just saturated the society with professional service providers. It just wreaked havoc on our society, particularly the black community.
Right. You talk about the Black Wall Street that existed, and one of them was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I find it fascinating of late that we've heard about the Tulsa race riots, which is incredibly important because even as a history teacher, it was an element of some history that I was not aware of until very recently. But what I find interesting is you talk about focusing on the success that made it a Black Wall Street.
And provoked the envy.
Right. But your focus is on that and then the rebuilding. And other people, professional historians and journalists and what have you in the last few years have focused on the tragedy of the race riots themselves.
They are crucifixionists.
Tell me more.
They only believe in crucifixion. They don't believe in restoration. Resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
Now you could look at that. You can look at it and say, "Yeah, there was a crucifixion."
Right.
But the story doesn't end there.
Right.
The story only ends on Easter Sunday morning. But there's so many people who are crucifixionists.
Right.
And I reject that. I'm a resurrectionist. It doesn't mean, but in order to be a resurrectionist, I had to believe in the crucifixion.
Right. Right. You have to
accept the fact that there was crucifixion.
Right. That these terrible things happen, that these race riots happen, that that achievement, those hotels and those businesses were destroyed.
But that was one. Others were not.
Right.
You had them in Durham, North Carolina, Black Bottom in Detroit, the Bronzeville section of Chicago. In our book, we listed if blacks in 1919 in the Bronzeville section of Chicago can generate 731 black-owned businesses and $100 million in real estate assets, how can you blame redlining?
Mm-hmm.
There was no such thing as access to the banks back then.
They just created their own.
They created their own through our own burial societies and our churches.
Right.
Because we didn't have insurance. So along with the collections, we put into a burial fund, and that became our sources of capital.
One other thing I want to talk about before we get to your books, which I want to dive into a little bit more, but violence-free zones. This has been a very successful program that has prevented shootings in schools. But again, it's based on these these grassroots leaders who have come up through the violence and through the problems within school systems and are contributing in important ways to change that.
Absolutely. If you have a school, for instance, of 1,000 kids, they are controlled by 10%. And that 10% by 10%.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get in and control that small number of kids who are dictating the actions of all those others, you can change a whole community. And that's what our youth advisors do.
Mm-hmm.
We hire young adults from the community suffering the problems who are witnesses by their own action that redemption is possible.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we call them credible messengers. And we take them and put them back into the school. Just like whenever there's a snake bite, how do they treat snake bite? They take the venom of the snake,
Mm-hmm.
right, and introduce it into the body.
Right.
And that creates an antivenom. That's what antivenom is. It's
Right.
a venom of the snake. It's the same principle. So the young adults circulate among the population in school, find out who that 10% cohort is, and they target them.
Mm-hmm.
And they go in, and as one of my youth advisors said, we sometimes have to wear our resumes on our chest. So they will walk up to a 16-year-old and say, "Where's your hall pass?" And he says, "I don't have a hall pass because I'm the head gangster here." He says, "No, shorty, I'm the head gangster now." He said, "Well, I'll get my brother on you." He said, "Here's my phone, call him. You tell him Flip's here. See what your brother says."
Mm-hmm.
So he says, "Now that you know I'm not going to dirty you and you're not going to dirty me, let me tell you why I'm talking to you like this. What you've done is given this young, tough kid an excuse and a respectful way to be peaceful. He's always wanted to be peaceful,
Mm-hmm.
but no one has showed him an avenue out of that predatory life that he can still earn the respect of those in his community. But only it takes someone from that community who understands that culture to be able to move around and influence people in such a way that it produces these kind of outcomes. But because a lot of those change agents don't have college degrees, you know, and when they talk, they will sometimes break verbs, split infinitives, and dangle participles, we tend to discount what they say.
Right. Right. And that takes us to your book, The Triumphs of Joseph. I want you, because you talk about being a Joseph or being a Pharaoh, and they're both worthwhile and they both have an important role to play. So recount the story of Joseph for us and how you see that as a model for changing communities for the better.
Well, as you know, in Genesis, Joseph was born one of 12 sons to his father. But he had the ability, he was his father's favorite, and his father gave him a cloak. And he was a little arrogant too.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was despised by his brothers. And he was out one day, and his brothers decided that they to inform on them. And so they faked his death and sold him into slavery. Killed a wild animal and smeared his cloak of many colors and told the father that he was devoured by a wild animal. But so Joseph was sold in by the Ishmaelites into slavery in Egypt. But he ended up in the house of Potiphar, the chief guard for Pharaoh, and he became the best prisoner, the best slave. And he also was very talented and a good steward. He was a very handsome young man, and Potiphar's wife lusted for him, but Joseph refused to have sex with her because he had horizontal integrity and vertical integrity. He said it was violate the trust that his master had in him, also sin against his God. And so, but she sent everybody out and came on to him and told everybody he was tried to rape her. So he went to jail for many years, but he became the best prisoner.
Mm-hmm.
And he interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the wine taster. And they promised to help him, but they left him. Long story short, Pharaoh had a dream that none of his soothsayers could interpret. And so the servant remembered Joseph could interpret dreams. So they brought Joseph up, cleaned him up, and said, bow down to the God Pharaoh. He said, I can't bow down to anybody but my God in heaven. So Pharaoh knew he had integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And he told Pharaoh, Pharaoh said, I understand you can interpret dreams. He says, no, God does that. So he had become humble.
Mm-hmm.
But I am merely God's instrument. And he said there was 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, to save up 20%, first flat tax. And appoint an overseer. And of course, they appointed an overseer, and he appointed Joseph. But think about how radical that was for an Egyptian to reach across all of those in his court,
mm-hmm.
to appoint a 31-year-old uneducated Hebrew shepherd and place him in charge. And Egypt prospered. And then the story goes when his brothers returned and whatnot. But I use that as a metaphor because there are two types of Joseph in urban centers.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who are in poverty but not of poverty. They're raising children that are not dropping out of school. They're in jail and drugs. No one ever goes to the homes of the 30% of the people in there who are in poverty to find out how are they able to thrive and survive when the 70% does not. There's no studies of that. The second type of Joseph, the kind you heard me describe, that they were fallen, they became prostitutes, and through God's grace they became redeemed, and they are powerful witnesses. So those are your two types of Joseph in urban centers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but if it wasn't for the good Pharaoh, and a good Pharaoh is a powerful person who's able to dream bad dreams in good times,
mm-hmm.
but also to take actions that contradict their culture and establish a relationship. So I look for wealthy pharaohs who have come together, funded, provided technical assistance to my Josephs, and we have rebuilt communities based upon these relationships.
Right. You talked about you're going to be doing a fundraiser soon for a school. And
in Chester,
Pennsylvania, and you have invited some of your pharaohs,
yes,
to come and extend their support potentially to the students of this school and to this school as a way of recognizing that good things are happening there, and that's the kind of thing they ought to be supporting.
Yes, any organization, whether you're a think tank or any organization, all of us have funders
mm-hmm.
who are pharaohs. I think we should be sharing some of those pharaohs with grassroots leaders.
Right.
And we are doing that by demonstrating by our own action that the people who fund the Woodson Center, they have multiple charities.
Right.
Why don't we direct some of those charitable dollars to the people who are value aligned with us?
Right.
So
and you talked before we started recording about one of the challenges of funding in the nonprofit world are those who look at politics and policy as the solution. And your experience over the last almost 50 years has told you something very different.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I will say about the left, they understand the need for a ground game. And conservatives don't do that. We will fund people to whine and complain about the problem, and they're going to talk about it on Fox.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're trying to establish an alternative for people who really care about the restoration of this country by sharing some of your donors with the Josephs in these communities so that we can change this country.
Right, right. Those who are either already successful, because I love that 30%, that let's talk to the people who are keeping their kids in school, who are keeping their kids out of trouble, and find out what are they doing?
Exactly.
How simple is that?
We call them resilience studies.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no, right now, people on left or right of center do never study the success of poor people.
Right. We study the problems, and this gets us back to the crucifixionists.
Right.
You know, that we study the dropouts and we try and figure out why are they dropping out instead of
how many people are
studying,
committing, what kind of crimes are they committing.
So we tend to talk about in you know, America today, and particularly that's where we want to talk about civic education, which we would define helping young people with the civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic dispositions. These idea of what are the things they need to know about the Constitution, about the principles that undergird our country, and as well as the skills that allow them within their community to help others, to respect others, to take personal responsibility. All of these are to participate in our system of government, to be productive members of society. These are all things we talk about. And then dispositions, this idea of patriotism, this idea that though we understand that no country is perfect, no system of government is perfect, but there is this love of country, that those are important principles. All of those are important to you. And a couple of years ago, the 1619 Project came out from the New York Times and purported to say, really, the country's rooted in slavery and racism, starting with those first 20 slaves who came to Jamestown in 1619. And you responded with others to say, no, that's not it. That the founding in 1776 is what ought to unite us. I want you to talk about why that was important for you to respond to.
Because none of us as individuals or as a nation should be defined by the worst of what we were.
Mm-hmm.
You know, slavery is America's birth defect.
Mm.
None of us should be defined by our birth defect. But America is also a country of second chances, a country of redemption. And so it's important to be accurate in our description, not just And so we assembled, since the messengers were black,
mm-hmm.
Hannah Nicole Jones, we thought the messengers to offer a counter proposal should be black. But we didn't want to engage in tribal debate with them.
Right.
We wanted to offer an inspirational and an aspirational alternative view. Not a single black was ever tried for treason in this country.
Mm.
We fought in every war, but not a single black was tried for treason, because we understood that in the Second World War, I remember that we used to have a double victory against fascism abroad and racism in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And we all fought. We had our black separate units, but we all fought. And so what we were, 1776, we developed curriculum that's now 30 lessons. To date, it's been downloaded 130,000 times mm-hmm. in 50 states. There is just a thirst for accurate American history when it comes to race and slavery and Jim Crow.
And you would be the first to say that doesn't mean whitewashing it. That doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. But it does mean having this perspective that says, yes, these things happen and we need to understand them. But also there were great accomplishment and achievement, and that what the founders gave us was an aspiration to all men are created equal, even though at that moment when Thomas Jefferson wrote it, it was certainly not equality before the law.
Read what Frederick Douglass said in his second July 4th address mm-hmm. when he talked about the need to support the founding values of this nation.
Right.
It is more important for blacks to do that.
And Dr. King says the same thing.
Dr. King said the same thing. And so what we're trying to do is just elevate that message and take it to a whole different level.
So I want to sort of end this with what may be a difficult question, but how do you interact with someone who is part of that 1619 project? I don't know if you've had the opportunity, but because we're all here together as Americans, and we deeply disagree. And you talk in your book about radical grace, and that's really where I want to end, is because that, to me, that idea of grace and extending that to someone who maybe doesn't deserve it at all, because that's what grace is. It's always extended to those who are undeserving of it. And yet it's so important, not only religiously, but I would argue in our politics today more than ever.
Dr. King described it as agape love.
Mm-hmm.
He says, what we should seek is not the destruction of our enemy, but to change his heart.
Mm-hmm.
That you can do this and still protect yourself. We give an example in our book of radical grace with Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was born a slave in Sumter, South Carolina. He found himself working on a southern supply ship. And one Friday night, he and 6 other crew members, when the captain went abroad, he stole the boat, picked up the families of his family and the 6, put on the master's hat, and maneuvered past 5 garrisons, and then turned the ship over to the Union Navy. And he was celebrated throughout the North.
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln, as a result of that, allowed blacks to fight in the Civil War. But also he became the first commissioned officer. And eventually, when the war was over, he became a wealthy businessman, served in Congress for 20 years. But also purchased a plantation on which he was a slave and took in the destitute family of the slave's wife and children,
mm-hmm.
even allowing her to sleep in her bed because she was delusional and didn't realize slavery had ended.
Mm.
That's an act of radical grace. And there are other examples. There were 20 blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires. Several of them purchased a plantation on which they were slaves. Only in America
mm-hmm.
could you have stories of not only restoration, but flourishing in the face of slavery and Jim Crow. Only in America would you have this.
I want to throw one more quote at you, and I promise this will be the last one. You say, America is in need of a revival.
Absolutely.
And that's, I mean, we think about the great revivals of the 19th century and those, the tents and, people coming from all over, what do you mean?
I mean, the biggest crisis facing America is not racial. We must deracialize race. It is the moral and spiritual freefall that is consuming our children, according to the Harvard study, that the highest rate of death, cause of death in the black community is homicide for children. In Appalachia is prescription drugs.
Yep.
And in Silicon Valley is suicide among teenagers. It's 6 times the national average.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order for us to fix that, we're going to have to put aside this racial antagonism and come together to figure out why there is such a hole in the hearts of our children to the point where they are denigrating their life and therefore taking it. If you devalue your life, then you'll either take someone else's or you'll take your own. Yeah. It's different sides of the same coin.
This has long been my biggest concern with gun violence is why is it there are so many people who are willing to turn to violence as the answer to whatever the problem is. And then until we start looking at that problem, we're not going to solve this. And I think that you're referring to that this is an epidemic at this point with young people.
But my position is if people born living in toxic, drug-infested, crime-ridden neighborhoods can find redemption and restoration and peace, they have something to teach everybody
Amen.
in society.
We always end with a quiz. So we'll just run through these, and whatever answer pops into your head is always the right one. So excluding Washington and Lincoln, who's your favorite president?
Who's my favorite president? Probably Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay. What's one thing you would want every American to learn more about?
Their faith in God.
Okay. If you had not chosen your career in working in poverty and civil rights, what do you think you would have become?
Probably an astronaut.
I love it. What pet peeve annoys you the most?
That people they can't see the importance of grace, where they're locked into anger and despair. They don't see the glory of grace.
What one thing about you would most people be surprised to learn?
That I like gospel bluegrass music.
Okay.
And
bluegrass.
opera.
Yeah. I love it.
Opera and country bluegrass. I listen to bluegrass, country,
opera and bluegrass.
Gospel.
That's,
bluegrass gospel.
That's great. That's a combination. What one lesson from your life would you most like to share with young people?
That no matter how tough life is, that you should embrace, be faithful to your future.
If you could meet just one historical person, who might it be?
Probably Frederick Douglass.
Okay. And final question, we ask this of everybody, bourbon or scotch?
Wine.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
Too old to drink that other stuff.
So thanks to our guest, Robert Woodson. Can't wait to have you back. Thank you for doing this with us.
Well, thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely. I also want to thank our producers, Laura Kennedy and Sarah Rasmussen, and a special shout out to friends of the pod, Bill Franz and Bob Gleason. Please subscribe, follow, rate, and review George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts, and tell your friends. And until next time, thank you.